Now you will learn all the secrets of one of the largest battles in human history, the 2nd century BC. The Mediterranean is engulfed in the flames of the greatest conflict of antiquity, the Second Punic War. Two superpowers, Rome and Carthage, clash on the battlefield, and the fate of all Western civilization depends on the outcome of their struggle. One of the key theaters of this war was Spain, a land rich in silver and brave warriors. It was here that the young Roman commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio, was preparing to fight a decisive battle that could drive the Carthaginians from the peninsula forever. Opposing him was a huge army, confident in its strength and numerical superiority. But Scipio had a plan based not on brute force, but on sophisticated psychology and deception. He was going to turn a predictable morning routine into a deadly trap, using the enemy's expectations against them. Watch the video to the end to find out how a cunning Roman strategy turned an ordinary morning march into one of the most brilliant victories in history. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret in military history, how the psychology, charisma, and intellect of one brilliant man can radically determine the fate of entire empires and change the course of history. In the 3rd century BC, Spain was not just another territory to be conquered, but the main strategic prize and a bone of contention in the fierce struggle between Rome and Carthage for dominance in the Mediterranean. Control over its rich silver mines in the mountains gave the victor the opportunity to mint huge quantities of coins and pay for the maintenance of huge armies of professional mercenaries, which was critical for waging a protracted war. Without Spanish silver, the war was doomed to failure due to a lack of funds to pay soldiers' salaries and purchase provisions. It was here, on this bloody Iberian soil, that the noble Scipio family suffered a terrible, humiliating defeat a few years earlier in 211 BC. His father, Publius Cornelius Scipio, and his uncle, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio, had fallen heroically in different battles against the superior forces of the Carthaginians, and the young 25-year-old Publius arrived in dangerous Spain, not only as an appointed commander with Imperium, but also as a man thirsting for personal revenge and passionately desiring to restore the tarnished honor of his ancient aristocratic family at any cost. He possessed a rare and incredible natural charisma that attracted people, and he was a master at instilling in his soldiers an unshakable belief in inevitable victory, even in hopeless situations, which was an invaluable quality for a commander. His soldiers idolized him and were ready to follow him through fire and water, believing in his genius. He was opposed on the battlefield by experienced, battle-hardened Carthaginian commanders of the highest rank: Hasdrubal, son of the influential Giscos, and Mago Barca, younger brother of the legendary Hannibal, who had struck terror into Italy. The cautious Hasdrubal was a calculating, methodical strategist of the old school who preferred reliable tactics to risk, while the impulsive Mago was rightly famous throughout the Mediterranean for his natural aggressiveness in battle and his unstoppable momentum in attacks. Together, they assembled a huge, diverse army of about 70,000 soldiers, the backbone of which was made up of invincible African veterans in heavy armor and numerous detachments of fierce Celtiberian mercenaries with cold weapons from local tribes. It was a formidable force that seemed invincible and greatly outnumbered the Romans. War in mountainous Spain had its own unique characteristics and features that significantly distinguished it from the large-scale battles on the plains of Italy, where Hannibal raged. The complex local landscape, cut by numerous mountain ranges and full-flowing rivers, strictly dictated the conditions for maneuver warfare and limited the possibilities. The fickle loyalty of the warlike Spanish tribes was as changeable as the wind, and they easily switched sides to whoever convincingly demonstrated greater military strength in action and generously promised greater material gains from looting and rewards. The Spaniards were mercenaries at heart, selling their swords to whoever paid more and won. The far-sighted Scipio understood perfectly well from experience that a simple head-on collision with numerically superior enemy forces must be avoided at all costs, as this would lead to inevitable defeat. He knew full well that his real strength lay not in the sheer number of soldiers under his banners, but in their excellent discipline, professional training, and tactical flexibility of the Roman legions, capable of reorganizing on the fly. His ingenious plan was to use cunning to force the overconfident Carthaginians into a decisive battle on his own terms, where the Roman advantages would be maximized. It was necessary to force the enemy to accept battle where and when it was advantageous to Rome, not Carthage. To successfully implement this cunning plan, it was first necessary to deeply understand the mindset, psychology, and habits of the enemy commander, Hasdrubal. The observant Scipio began to methodically study his opponent, his tactical habits in past battles, and his conservative approach to the traditional formation of troops in battle order. Through reconnaissance and analysis, he carefully noted that the cautious Carthaginian invariably preferred the tried and tested classical tactics of the ancients, placing his strongest elite units of African infantry in the center of the battle formation for a breakthrough. This was a predictability that could be used against him. This keen observation of the enemy and analytical mind became the golden key to the Romans' future brilliant victory. Scipio ingeniously decided to use his opponent's very predictability and conservatism as a deadly weapon against him. He began to carefully prepare a complex psychological gambit and deception, in which every soldier in his relatively small army had to play his assigned role in the spectacle perfectly, without knowing the overall plan. It was a war of minds, not muscles, where every detail mattered. It was this revolutionary emphasis on the military psychology of the enemy, deception and cunning, rather than brute physical strength and numbers, that fundamentally distinguished the young Scipio from the overwhelming majority of conservative commanders of his era, who thought in stereotypes. He innovatively waged war not only with a sharp sword and spear, but also with a sophisticated mind, intellect, and diplomacy. And the upcoming decisive battle was to be a triumph of his outstanding intellect over the experience and traditions of the enemy, proof of the superiority of mind over force. Scipio pitted genius against experience. Everything that mattered was at stake in this confrontation. Strategic control over wealthy Spain and its mines, the material resources critically needed to continue the grueling war with Carthage, and the personal reputation of the youngest Scipio as a commander and future leader of Rome.
Victory is not found in the clash of swords, but in the wisdom of our minds.
The upcoming bloody battle at Illipa in 206 BC was to finally show the entire ancient world whose military strategy and philosophy of war would prove to be more perfect and effective, Roman or Carthaginian, mind or force. The outcome of the battle would determine the fate not only of Spain, but of the entire Second Punic War. Do you think that a commander's personal qualities, charisma, intelligence, innovation, are really more important than the absolute size of his army and its weaponry? Share your informed opinion in the comments below. Are you ready to learn the truth about how the armies that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean were assembled? Two huge military machines converged on the plain near the city of Illipa. Scipio's army numbered about 45,000 infantrymen and 3,000 horsemen. The core of his forces were battle-hardened Roman legions, known for their iron discipline and ability to act as a single unit. Alongside them stood allied Italian contingents, who were just as tough. But a big part of the army was made up of Spanish allies, whose reliability hadn't been tested yet in a crucial moment. The Carthaginian army was much larger and more diverse. Hasdrubal and Mago fielded about 70,000 infantrymen, 4,000 cavalrymen, and 32 war elephants. It was one of the largest armies ever assembled by Carthage. Its striking force consisted of Libyan and African infantrymen, veterans of many campaigns who were considered the best infantry in the world after the Romans. However, most of the army was made up of Spanish mercenaries fighting for Carthaginian gold. Their morale and resilience depended directly on which side luck would favor. Two huge camps were set up opposite each other, separated by a wide plain. Every day, life in the camps followed a strict routine. Soldiers cleaned their weapons, trained, and prepared for the coming battle, the outcome of which was completely unpredictable. Supplying such a large number of people was a complex logistical task. Huge convoys of food and fodder made their way to the camps, and control of the supply routes was no less important than tactical maneuvers on the battlefield. Every commander understood that a hungry army was an army incapable of fighting. Scipio and Hasdrubal waited, studying each other and looking for the right moment to start the battle. The weather was clear, and the hills surrounding the plain offered an impressive view of the two forces ready to clash in a decisive battle. The tension grew with each passing day. Each commander assessed the strengths and weaknesses of his opponent. Scipio knew that his advantage lay in the quality and discipline of his legions. Hasdrubal relied on his numerical superiority and the power of his African veterans. There was a sense of anticipation in the air. Soldiers from both armies understood that they were about to take part in one of those battles that would determine the course of history for decades to come. The only question was who would strike first. What factor do you think was decisive in ancient battles? The training of the soldiers, the genius of the commander, or the quality of the equipment? But what if I told you that the main battle took place not on the field, but in the minds of the soldiers even before the first clash? What I am about to show you was a psychological experiment that did not go according to plan for one of the sides. Scipio began his sophisticated game. For several days in a row, he led his army out of camp and lined it up for battle. Each time, the formation was exactly the same and predictable. Scipio placed his best troops, the Roman legions, in the center. On the flanks, he placed his less reliable Spanish allies. Hasdrubal, seeing this, responded in kind. He also led his army out and lined it up opposite the Romans. In the center, against the Roman legions, he placed his elite African veterans, and on the flanks, Spanish mercenaries. This continued for several days in a row. The two armies took to the field, stood opposite each other in full battle order, and then, without ever starting the battle, dispersed to their camps. It became a kind of daily ritual. For the soldiers, it was exhausting and incomprehensible. They spent hours under the sun in heavy armor, waiting for an order that never came. But Scipio had a clear plan, and this routine was an important part of it. He deliberately created a sense of predictability for Hasdrubal and his army. He wanted the Carthaginians to get used to the idea that the Romans would always line up in the same way, the legions in the center, the Spaniards on the flanks. He lulled his opponent into a false sense of security. This war of nerves was no less important than the battle itself. Scipio instilled in Hasdrubal a false sense of control. The Carthaginian commander was confident that he had figured out the Romans' tactics and knew what to expect on the day of the decisive battle. With each passing day, this confidence in the Carthaginian camp only grew stronger. The soldiers got used to the daily spectacle and stopped seeing anything unusual in it. They were sure that when the battle finally began, it would follow a familiar scenario. Scipio, meanwhile, waited patiently for the moment when his psychological trap would be ready to snap shut. He knew that a single sudden change in the usual order of things at the decisive moment would cause confusion among his opponents, and in that confusion would lie his chance for victory. Thus, the main events took place not on the battlefield, but in the minds of the commanders and their soldiers. Scipio played a subtle game in which expectations, habits, and predictability were his weapons. He was setting the stage for his triumph. Guess what happened next when one of the generals decided to break all the rules? On the day Scipio chose for battle, everything went differently than on previous days. He gave the order to wake his soldiers before dawn. The legionnaires ate breakfast quickly and quietly and received all the necessary equipment. While the Carthaginian camp was still asleep, the Roman army, in full combat readiness, was already beginning to march onto the field. This was the first violation of the usual ritual. Then Scipio made the key move in his game, completely turning the chessboard upside down. He gave orders for a formation that was the complete opposite of what everyone had seen in previous days. He placed his best troops, the Roman legions, on the flanks. In the center, the most important position, he placed his Spanish allies. It was an incredibly risky maneuver. He deliberately weakened his center in order to strengthen his flanks as much as possible. When the news that the Romans were already on the field reached the Carthaginian camp, there was commotion. Hasdrubal was caught off guard. His soldiers had to rush to grab their weapons without having time to eat breakfast or prepare properly. Seeing the Roman army before him, Hasdrubal did exactly what Scipio had expected. Acting out of habit and with no time to think, he deployed his troops according to the old plan. He placed his elite Africans in the center to oppose the strongest Roman units. But he did not know that this time his veterans were not facing legions, but the less resilient Spaniards. And his own weak flanks, manned by mercenaries, found themselves face to face with the striking force of the Roman army. The legions. The trap had been sprung even before the battle began. The Roman army was well-fed, organized, and acting according to a premeditated plan. The Carthaginian army, on the other hand, had been rushed into the field. Its soldiers were hungry, and their commander had already made a fatal mistake. The advantage created by Scipio was enormous. Thus, even before the first clash, Scipio had won the most important part of the battle. He used psychology and deception to force the enemy to act in a way that was advantageous to him. Now all that remained was to carry out his ingenious plan. How important do you think the element of surprise is in warfare? In the next chapter, you will see how this simple but ingenious change in formation turned the battlefield into a perfectly tuned mechanism.
Advance, Legion! For Rome!
The battle began. On Scipio's orders, the entire Roman line moved forward in perfect order. The sight of tens of thousands of soldiers marching steadily forward was a grand and frightening spectacle. However, about halfway to the enemy, Scipio gave his next crucial order. He instructed his center, where the Spanish allies were positioned, to slow down sharply. They were to move forward as slowly as possible, practically trampling on the spot. At the same time, the flanks, where the Roman legions were located, accelerated their movement. They did not just march forward, but also began to perform a complex maneuver, turning slightly outward. This maneuver required incredible coordination and training, which only the Roman legions were capable of. As a result of these actions, the straight battle line of the Romans began to bend. It turned into a huge crescent or arc, with its concave side facing the enemy. The center deliberately lagged behind, while the flanks rushed forward. This tactic in military history became known as the receding center. Scipio deliberately avoided fighting in the center, where the enemy had its strongest troops. He did not want his Spaniards to clash with Hasdrubal's African veterans. The Carthaginian army, not expecting such a maneuver, continued to advance in a straight line. Their mighty center was moving toward emptiness, as the Roman center was retreating. Their flanks, on the contrary, were rapidly closing in on the advancing Roman legions. Hasdrubal did not immediately understand what was happening. He saw that the Romans had broken formation and may have considered this a sign of weakness or a mistake. But it was not a mistake. It was a perfectly executed plan. In this way, Scipio completely controlled the geometry of the battle. He forced Hasdrubal to fight where he had an overwhelming advantage, on the flanks. And in the center, where the Carthaginians had the advantage, the battle never began. The battlefield turned into a giant tactical trap. Without realizing it, the Carthaginian army was walking straight into the trap set for it. The fate of the battle now depended on the steadfastness of the flanks. Scipio's maneuver divided the enemy army into three parts, preventing them from helping each other. His legions were able to deal with the enemy's flanks separately, while the Carthaginians' elite center was temporarily taken out of the battle. What if I showed you a time machine to see how the perfect tactical trap works? The reinforced Roman flanks, consisting of select legionaries, descended on the flanks of the Carthaginian army. There stood Spanish mercenaries who did not expect to encounter the best of the Romans on their way. The clash was fierce, but its outcome was a foregone conclusion. The Roman legions, superior to their opponents in discipline, weaponry, and fighting spirit, began to overwhelm the mercenaries. But that was only the beginning of the maneuver. Immediately after the first strike, Scipio gave the next order. His legions, without ceasing pressure from the front, began to perform another complex maneuver, bending their flanks inward. They began to encircle the flanks of the Carthaginian army from the sides. As a result, Hasdrubal's Spanish mercenaries found themselves under attack from two sides, from the front and from the flank. They were caught in a classic tactical pincer movement. Their formation began to crack at the seams. At the same time, the mighty Carthaginian center, consisting of African veterans, stood idle. Rome's Spanish allies maneuvered slowly in front of them, without engaging in serious combat. The Africans were cut off from the flanks and could not come to their aid. They were forced to watch as the best Roman troops crushed their allies. It was a severe blow to their morale. The elite of the Carthaginian army found themselves passive spectators at the most decisive moment of the battle. Scipio perfectly calculated the timing and speed of his troops' movements. His plan worked like clockwork. The legions on the flanks acted in a coordinated and precise manner, performing complex maneuvers right in the middle of the battle. Under the double attack, the Carthaginian flanks could not hold out. The mercenaries, who fought for money rather than for an idea, were not prepared to stand to the end in such hopeless conditions. Their ranks faltered, and soon they began to retreat. Scipio's tactics worked brilliantly. He defeated the more numerous enemy army in parts. He used his strengths against the enemy's weaknesses, neutralizing their main advantage. How effective can encirclement tactics be? In the next chapter, we will see how weather conditions and terrain made their own adjustments to the outcome of this grand battle. The retreat of the mercenaries on the flanks quickly turned into a panicked flight. Soldiers threw down their weapons and tried to save themselves, causing chaos and confusion in the ranks of their own army. This was the beginning of the end for the entire Carthaginian army. Panic spread like wildfire from the flanks to the center. The African veterans, who had previously stood as an unbreakable wall, saw their army crumbling before their eyes. Their fighting spirit, unbroken in dozens of battles, faltered. Now the victorious Roman legions, having dealt with the flanks, turned inward. They descended on the exposed sides of the elite Carthaginian center. The Africans, Hasdrubal's best soldiers, found themselves surrounded. They fell into the same trap that Hannibal had lured the Romans into at Cunning, but this time the roles were reversed. The Romans struck from the front, from both flanks, and even began to encircle the rear. The situation of the Carthaginian veterans became hopeless. Hasdrubal realized that the battle was lost. The only thing he could do was try to save the remnants of his elite troops. He gave the order for a general retreat, but it was already impossible to retreat in an orderly manner under such conditions. The retreat instantly turned into a disorderly flight. The entire huge Carthaginian army, which had seemed invincible that morning, rolled back to its camp. The Romans pursued them, giving them no respite. Scipio won a complete and unconditional victory. His risky plan, based on psychology, deception, and the perfect training of the legions, worked flawlessly. He did not just win, he destroyed the enemy army. The battlefield was a horrific sight. The vast plain was littered with abandoned weapons and equipment. The Carthaginian army, as a unified force, ceased to exist. It was not just a victory, it was a triumph of Roman military thought. Scipio proved that tactical skill and discipline can overcome any numerical superiority. The Battle of Illipa went down in history as a model of military art. The day that began with a cunning maneuver ended with the complete defeat of one of the largest armies of antiquity. But the struggle was not over yet. The remnants of the Carthaginians took refuge in their camp, and Scipio had to finish what he had started. The defeated remnants of the Carthaginian army fled in panic to their fortified camp. They hoped to find refuge behind its ramparts from the pursuing Roman legions. But Scipio had no intention of giving them that opportunity. The Romans, inspired by their victory, relentlessly pursued their fleeing enemy. They did not allow the Carthaginians to regroup and organize their defense. The pursuit was fierce and merciless. And at that moment, nature intervened. The sky, which had been clear all morning, suddenly became overcast with heavy clouds. A torrential rain, typical for this region, began to fall. The plain across which the Carthaginians were retreating instantly turned into a sea of mud. This greatly slowed their flight and brought even greater chaos to their ranks. Soldiers got stuck in the mud, losing their shoes and equipment. The rain and mud also hindered their pursuers, but the organized Roman cohorts coped with the difficulties much better than the demoralized Carthaginian crowd. The Romans surrounded the enemy camp, completely cutting off their retreat. The siege began. The Carthaginian soldiers were trapped. They were locked in their camp, with no hope of outside help. Their fighting spirit was completely broken. Scipio, however, did not immediately storm the camp. He understood that this would lead to unnecessary losses in his own army. Instead, he decided to wear down the enemy, knowing that hunger and disease would soon set in the besieged camp. The Romans dug trenches around the camp and erected fortifications, creating a continuous blockade line. The Carthaginian army, which until recently had threatened the entire Roman presence in Spain, was now locked in a dirty cage. The situation had changed dramatically. The night brought only a temporary respite to the besieged. Cold rain continued to pour down, turning the camp into a swamp. The soldiers, tired, hungry, and wet, sat by dying fires, realizing the hopelessness of their situation. Scipio once again demonstrated his patience and strategic wisdom. He did not succumb to the temptation of a quick but bloody assault. He allowed time, hunger, and despair to do their work. Inside the besieged Carthaginian camp, despair reigned. Morale was completely crushed. The soldiers understood that their commanders had led them to disaster and now could offer no way out. Hasdrubal and Mago also realized that the situation was completely hopeless. Continuing to resist was pointless. It was already impossible to save the army, and they decided to save themselves. Under cover of night, taking advantage of the bad weather, the Carthaginian commanders, along with a small detachment of bodyguards and cavalrymen, secretly left the camp. They abandoned their huge army to its fate. Their goal was to reach the coast and sail to Africa. When morning came, the soldiers in the camp discovered that they had been betrayed by their own commanders. The news was the last straw. Deprived of leadership, the army instantly lost all semblance of organization. The Spanish mercenaries, who made up the bulk of the army, saw no point in continuing to fight for a cause that even their employers had abandoned. They began to surrender en masse to the Romans, or tried in small groups to slip through the blockade lines to return to their native tribes. Within a few hours, the Carthaginian army in Spain simply ceased to exist. It disintegrated, scattered, and nothing remained of it except thousands of prisoners and a huge amount of abandoned weapons. It was a complete and final defeat. The Romans occupied the deserted camp without a fight. Their spoils were enormous. They captured not only weapons and equipment, but also the entire treasury of the Carthaginian army, which was intended to pay the mercenaries' salaries. Scipio had achieved his goal. He had not only won the battle, he had completely destroyed Carthage's military machine on the Iberian Peninsula. After the Battle of Illipa, Carthage no longer had the strength to wage active warfare in Spain. The victory was achieved not only thanks to tactical genius, but also thanks to the weakness of the enemy. The betrayal of the commanders who abandoned their soldiers demonstrated the fundamental difference between the Roman army, which fought for the Republic, and the Carthaginian army, which relied on money and the authority of its commanders. The end of the Carthaginian army was inglorious. It fell apart not in battle, but because of internal decay. Scipio, on the other hand, cemented his reputation as one of the greatest commanders of his time. The far-reaching consequences of the decisive Battle of Illipa were truly enormous and significant, extending far beyond the geographical boundaries of Spain alone and influencing the entire course of history. For the powerful Carthage, this crushing defeat meant the final, irretrievable loss of its most valuable and profitable overseas province on the Iberian Peninsula, all the richest silver mines in the mountains, and the inexhaustible source of brave, warlike mercenaries from local tribes unconditionally passed under the complete military and economic control of victorious Rome forever. Carthage lost not only territory, but also the financial basis of its military machine, which effectively predetermined the outcome of the entire war in Rome's favor. The young Scipio, having won this brilliant, exemplary victory thanks to his genius, became the absolute and undisputed master of the entire Iberian Peninsula and its resources. He methodically laid a solid political and administrative foundation for centuries of Roman rule and presence in Spain, which subsequently had a colossal, indelible impact on the culture, religion, architecture, and language of this diverse region for millennia. The ambitious dream of the ambitious Barcid family, led by Hannibal, to create an independent Spanish-Carthaginian empire as a counterweight to Rome, was shattered forever, buried under the rubble of defeat. The Barcids lost everything they had fought for decades in Spain. For the youngest Scipio, this resounding military triumph at the age of 25 became the most important step towards the unattainable heights of military glory and political career in Rome. He returned triumphantly to eternal Rome as a national hero and savior of the Republic, greeted by cheering crowds. His personal authority among citizens and popularity with the people were so colossal and unshakable that the conservative Senate, despite his provocative youth and lack of formal experience, was forced to entrust him with supreme command of the invasion army for a daring invasion of Africa itself in the siege of Carthage. This was an unprecedented trust for such a young commander, but his victory spoke louder than any words or traditions. The strategic victory at Illipa gave Rome a decisive strategic advantage in the entire protracted war and the initiative. Now, a stronger Rome had the opportunity and resources to move the theater of war directly into the enemy's territory in Africa, forcing the great Hannibal, who had remained undefeated in Italy for 15 years, to seriously worry about defending his native Carthage from invasion. This was a real turning point, a point of no return in the bloody Second Punic War, which had already lasted almost 2 decades. The initiative finally passed to Rome, and Carthage went on the defensive, which psychologically demoralized its citizens. The personal fate of the defeated Carthaginian commanders after Illipa was tragically sad and inglorious. The disgraced Hasdrubal, son of Gisco, returned with the remnants of his army to Carthage after a shameful retreat. Unable to convincingly justify himself before the Council of Elders for the crushing defeat and loss of Spain, he voluntarily committed suicide with poison to avoid a humiliating public trial and execution. The military career of the brave Mago Barca, Hannibal's younger brother, was also irrevocably shattered by this defeat, and he never again played a significant role in the ongoing war with Rome, remaining in secondary roles. The defeat ruined the careers and lives of these experienced commanders, demonstrating the cruelty of ancient politics. The historic Battle of Illipa is often unfairly overshadowed by more widely known battles of antiquity, such as the legendary Cannae or the decisive Zama in textbooks. However, in terms of its long-term strategic and political significance for the outcome of the war, it is in no way inferior in importance, and perhaps even surpasses them. It was here on the fields of Spain that the young Scipio methodically honed and perfected his outstanding tactical skills of deception and maneuver, which he would later apply with great success in the final battle against the invincible Hannibal at Zama. Illipa was a rehearsal for future triumph, where Scipio tested his revolutionary ideas in practice and proved their effectiveness. This outstanding battle has forever become a classic textbook example in military history of how a talented commander, significantly inferior to his opponent in terms of troop numbers and resources, can achieve a crushing victory thanks to his clear superiority in strategy, flexible tactics, and understanding of the enemy's psychology. The brilliant Scipio masterfully used military deception and disinformation to artificially create the most favorable conditions for himself, and then delivered a crushing blow with surgical precision and impeccable timing at the critical moment. It was a victory of mind over force, of planning over improvisation, which became a model for future generations of military leaders. A detailed study of the tactics of this battle and its lessons has been included in virtually all military textbooks and academies around the world as required material. It clearly demonstrates the critical importance of a commander's flexible strategic thinking, the ability to surprise a confident opponent with an unconventional decision, and the ideal professional training of troops to perform complex maneuvers. This was not simply a brutal clash between two large armies on the battlefield, but a true intellectual contest between two diametrically opposed military philosophies: conservative and innovative, tradition and innovation. The victory of innovation proved that the future belongs to those who are capable of thinking outside the box. The invaluable historical legacy of the victory at Illipa is convincing proof of the indisputable fact that wars are won not only by numerical superiority and the number of soldiers, but also by sharp minds, strategy, and discipline. The brilliant victory of the young Scipio finally opened the way for a strengthened Rome to achieve undisputed military and political dominance throughout the Mediterranean for centuries to come. And weakened Carthage, having irretrievably lost rich Spain and its resources, lost the material resources critically necessary to continue the war, and its last faint hope of victory in the great exhausting war against Rome. The fate of Carthage was sealed by the defeat at Illipa, although formally the war continued for several more years until the final surrender. We see how the Battle of Illipa became the pinnacle of Publius Cornelius Scipio's strategic genius. He turned the weaknesses of his army into an advantage and the strengths of his enemy into a trap. It was a victory of intellect, discipline, and psychology over brute force and numerical superiority. The complex maneuver with a receding center and reinforced flanks, prepared by days of psychological warfare, worked flawlessly. Scipio did not simply win, he dictated the entire course of the battle to the enemy, from the first to the last step. This victory not only brought Spain to Rome, but also paved the way for the final triumph in the Second Punic War. The history of the Battle of Illipa teaches us that even the most ingenious plan requires perfect execution, and even the most powerful army can be defeated if its commander falls into the trap of his own expectations. It was not just a battle, it was the art of war at its finest. What other episode from the history of great battles would you like to see on our channel? Suggest your topics in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.